And so that probably makes for a good tie-in this evening into our lesson here in Psalm 62, because I promise you, there is a family today. There's a mom and there are some children whose lives have been hit with a storm they never imagined. And you know, a ship at sea, uh, its anchor and the strength of that anchor is oftentimes determined by the power of the storm. And in the same manner, the true object of our trust as believers, it's not manifested in the easy times. Really our trust towards God is manifested when the gales of life blow upon our small vessel. We find David was in such a storm. Psalm 62, it's generally believed by theologians and those that delve into biblical history. They believe Psalm 62 was penned during Absalom's rebellion, perhaps even shortly after David has fled from the city of Jerusalem. David found himself in very bleak circumstances. He was being deposed from the throne, that seemingly, to all outside appearance, that he was on his way to defeat and even death. And yet, even in a season of tears and of fears, David, he looked to God and determined that he would only trust Him. He trusted God though he was being pursued by his son. He trusted God even though he had recently been cursed by Shimei. He trusted God even though the memory of past failures still haunted him. He refused to allow every attack he was facing dictate his faith. And so under the inspiration of God in a great stormy season of life, he picks up his pen, and before a single thing in his life has changed, before a single circumstance has calmed down, he pens Psalm 62, which is a psalm expressing trust towards God. And so we want to look at David this evening and see why his situations, they didn't shake him and neither did they break him. And we'll see why. There's about 4 movements through this psalm I want to draw your attention to tonight. We're going to look, first of all, at David's confession of trust. He began this psalm by stating his trust before he ever begins to deal with some of the realities that he faces. We see David's comforting in trust, how as he was trusting God, again, before anything around him changed, that God was ministering comfort to his heart. David, we're going to look at his counsels of trust. Again, nothing has changed. All of this is happening in the same moment of time, and yet as God begins to minister to his heart, David begins to have a desire to minister to other people and to be a help unto them. And then we're going to see David's conclusions of trust, that he sums some things up by what he is absolutely persuaded about his God. So look with me, if you would, this evening. Psalm 62, begin reading there in verse number 1. It says, to the chief musician, Jeduthun, a psalm of David. He says, truly my soul waiteth upon God, from Him cometh my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved. How long will ye imagine mischief against a man? Ye shall be slain, all of you. As a bowing wall shall ye be, and as a tottering fence. They only consult to cast him down from his excellency. They delight in lies. They bless with their mouth, but they curse inwardly. Selah. My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from Him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. In God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God. Trust in Him at all times, ye people. Pour out your heart before Him. God is a refuge for us. Selah. Surely men of low degree are vanity, and men of high degree are a lie. To be laid in the balance, they are altogether lighter than vanity. Trust not in oppression, and become not vain in robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart upon them. God hath spoken once. Twice have I heard this, that power belongeth unto God. Also unto Thee, O Lord, belongeth mercy, for thou renderest to every man according to his work. And so let's consider the fact that David's desire was to only trust in his God. You see in verses 1 and 2, David begins this psalm with his confession of trust. He starts out by saying, "Truly my soul waiteth upon God. From Him cometh my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved." That he began his ordeal with his enemies by trusting in God. That trust was the starting point of David's heart and spirit, and trust continued to be his main objective as he was writing this psalm, and as he's going now through a great time of affliction in his life. His desire was that he might trust God in every season and every situation. Not just to trust God on the mountains of life, but now in the deepest and darkest valleys of life, facing a situation that no man would want to face, to have your life hanging in the balance and being pursued. But to make matters worse, his life was hanging in balance, and he was being pursued by none other than his own child. That's who was seeking after David's life. And so, no doubt that things are just are blowing upon his soul. The winds of chaos have begun to move across his life, and yet he is determined, "Lord, I'm going to trust you regardless of what comes." And so he trusted, first of all, in God's defense. There in verse number 1, he states that the only place that he's looking is unto God. He says, "Truly my soul waiteth upon God. From Him cometh my salvation. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved." That as his throne and his people and his very life were hanging in the balance, David makes a wise decision. That he cast himself intentionally upon God and God alone. He begins verse number 1 by saying, I'm just going to wait on God. He said, "Truly my soul waiteth upon God." That he knew that what he was facing was beyond his ability to make any kind of a change. Yes, David was a great military leader, but you know what? His army was completely outnumbered. Yes, David was a wise leader, but he's now the king of a kingdom that's in travail, and he's been ousted from the throne. So there was nothing he could do to change his situation. That what he was going through was far beyond his ability to control, far beyond his capacity to make any type of difference. That truly he found himself in the midst of chaos and confusion, and in that chaos and confusion, instead of blaming God for the situation, he looks with a trusting eye to God in the situation. And he doesn't try to solve his problems himself. He makes a decision. "Lord, I'm just going to stop and wait upon you." He said, "Truly my soul waiteth upon God." It's an amazing thing. David understood this. Instead of trying to get in a hurry to figure out how I can fix what's wrong, he said, perhaps I ought to let God have His say in this thing. David understood this, that sometimes when we get in a hurry because life has gotten off kilter, our little ship is rocking upon the sea, so to speak, that often we get rushed to make a change. And often what we do is we make rash decisions. And rash decisions tend to be wrong decisions. And so David said, "You know what? I'm able to see that no matter what I do, that really I can't change anything. So Lord, I'm going to determine to wait upon you in this situation." Now, God grant me the faith to be able to do something like that, because if I try to picture myself in David's position, basically running for my life, in my mind, I'm just being honest, I'd be trying to figure out everything I could do to save my own neck and to change things. And yet David saw beyond that. He says, "No, there's nothing in my power. And so, Lord, the only course of action, the only wise decision is to wait upon you. God, let you come to my defense." And so we see something about David as he's trusting God's defense. He was determined that he wasn't going to allow the circumstance of his life to dictate the confidence of his heart and of His Spirit. Again, I said it's easy to trust God when everything is good. But how about when everything's gone haywire? How about when you're hurting and you don't know where to turn, don't know what to do, have no answers to give? Will you stop and trust God during that season? Will you be like David and determine, you know what? God is my only rock. I've trusted Him before. I'm sure that He will not fail me now. He said He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved. So David trusted in God's defense and trusted in God's deliverance. He believed that God would truly deliver him from the enemy's devices and the enemy's deceits. Note, if you would, in verse 3 and 4 that as David is writing out this psalm, it's as though he turns to address those that are pursuing after him. He says, beginning in verse 3, "How long will you imagine mischief against a man? Ye shall be slain, all of you. As a bowing wall shall you be, and as a tottering fence. They only consult to cast down from His excellency. They delight in lies. They bless with their mouth, but they curse inwardly." Selah. That David understood that Absalom and his co-conspirators had done nothing but imagine mischief against David. He was facing those that had plotted and had schemed to overthrow him. But David understood something, that as he had confidence and was exercising trust in God, holding on to the promises God had given him, he knew this, that ultimately those plans had to fail. He said there in verse number 3, he said, "Ye shall be slain, all of you. As a bowing wall shall ye be, and as a tottering fence." They saw David as the one that was weak and ready to just be knocked over. But David said, "Guys, no, you've got this thing backwards." He said, "I'm not the one being hunted down right now." He said, "Whether you realize it or not, it's God that's going to hunt you down. You're the ones that are going to be slain." They saw him as weak and ready to fall, but didn't realize that was the position they'd put themselves in, that they were going to face the judgment of God when God stood up to defend David, and they would be slain. That his enemies had only devised deceptions and deviousness. And David said, the very things you've been involved in, that's going to be your undoing. That's where your disaster is going to come from. And so what he does is, he stops and with an eye of faith, he considers his own confidence towards God versus the corruption that they exhibited. And so he comes to the conclusion, how could I not trust in God for my deliverance? I appreciate a man like David that could lift his eyes above the temporal and see what the real problem was. The problem was a spiritual battle. But it was finding its way into the natural realm. It was finding its way into his life and against his throne and his rule and against those that he loved. But he realized at the end of the day, this is a spiritual battle. And the only way to fight a spiritual battle is with confidence toward God. So, Lord, my trust is in Thee. And so his confession of trust is found here in these first 4 verses. Notice the comfort from his trust, beginning in verse number 5. He says, "My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from Him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. In God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God." That as David exercised trust towards God, God has gone to work in the recesses of David's soul. And let me show that to you for just a moment. Notice how in verse number 5, how David, first of all, he was soothed in his anguish. There in verse 5, he says, "My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from Him." You know, David waited expectantly upon God. You know, he didn't think that God was going to fail him. He didn't believe that God would forget about him and didn't believe that God would forsake him. In fact, in verse number 5, it seems to me David already believed that the answer was on the way. He knew that God would not turn His back upon His promises, that God does not forsake His own people. And so David said, my soul can be still and wait patiently upon God. He says there in verse number 5, for my expectation is from Him. It's as though David is saying, I really believe God is about to cast me a lifeline, as it were. What you see is a believer who's experiencing calm in the midst of tempest, or what we would call a peace that passeth all understanding. David wasn't just hoping God would deliver him. He was expecting God to deliver him, and so therefore he was soothed. You know why? Because faith conquers fears. God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. The Word of God tells us, be careful for nothing, but in everything, with prayer and supplication, make your request to God. What a blessed thought that we can cast all our cares upon Him, for He careth for us. That we can read over in Hebrews chapter number 13 that I will never leave thee nor forsake thee. You realize all of those are promises of a God who cannot violate His Word? And so that, like David, that when we find the situation of life has been absolutely turned on its head, that we ought to be able to approach that with that same stillness of soul, that same calmness within, where God by His Spirit has quelled the raging waves of our soul, where God speaks peace into the heart of those that are facing untold circumstance. So David, by exercising his trust, he's receiving comfort from God. He's being soothed in his anguish in verse number 5. Then look in verse number 6. He's getting settled in his anxiety. He says in verse 6, He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. That he was able to face overwhelming realities without being overthrown within his heart. You see, in verses 5 and 6, you'll notice something. It's very similar to verses 1 and 2. And that's because David is doing something. He's rehearsing the truth he has already believed and he has already confessed. In other words, he's driving this truth deeper into his heart and into his mind. One of the things that will help you and I, especially whenever we get hit suddenly and we get hit with something that just absolutely is devastating to us, is to drive the truth home. I mean, take those things about God that you know to be true and hammer it down into the soil of your soul. And that's exactly what David is doing. He's rehearsing truth. He started in verses 1 and 2 saying, Truly my soul waiteth upon God. From Him cometh my salvation. He said, He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be greatly moved. And then notice how he rehearses that in verses 5 and 6. My soul, wait thou only upon God, for my expectation is from Him. He only is my rock and my salvation. He is my defense. I shall not be moved. And so as he's rehearsing the truth, he's getting increasingly stabilized within his heart and his spirit. Notice how there's a difference between verse 2 and verse 6. In verse 2, as he's confessing his trust, he said, I shall not be greatly moved. But by the time you get down to verse number 6, that word greatly is gone. He just simply says, I shall not be moved. Now, I was reading a commentary by J. Vernon McGee, and as he was discussing this, he brought up an illustration of a story that was told of a Scottish woman that in a church service, she was able to stand up and give testimony. And she said this, she said, my heart might tremble while I stand on the rock, but I'm glad that I may tremble on top of the rock does not tremble beneath me. That's what David has come to the conclusion. Lord, you know what? I don't even have to fear being moved at all. You're not moved by what I'm facing through. You're the rock that is unchanging. What he had said in Psalm 61, you're the rock that is higher than I. He understood God's permanence. He understood that God was not shaken by what he was going through. And so if God is not shaken and my hope is stayed upon him, why should I even be shaken? And his example teaches us something. That if we find ourselves as believers in a situation where we're continually torn up on the inside, and we're continually without peace, it's an indicator that the truth has not been saturating our heart and our mind. One of the worst things that we can ever do is to think that God's truth has failed just because life doesn't go our way. Now, I realize that's a whole lot easier to preach than it is to live. But let me just draw just a real-life illustration. Right now, there is a mother without a husband and children without a father. And all the well-meaning platitudes that men give, and telling them right now how much their heart breaks, and things of that nature, I'm sure it's appreciated, but the only thing that'll stabilize a family going through what they're going through right now is to rehearse the truth of God. To remember, you know what? It didn't surprise God one bit. He knew all about it. We may not understand the purpose and we may not understand the plan, but that's not ours to have all figured out. God still reigns and rules sovereign over this world. And what seems like chaos unto us is perfectly known unto Him. That's hard truth, but it's truth that stabilizes the soul. And so, if you and I as believers, when things get rough, if we're continually tossed to and fro, it's a clear indicator we need to get truth in us. We need to remind ourselves about truth. We need to believe the truth. So David, he got settled in his anxiety and he was strengthened in his anticipation. He said there in verse 7, "And God is my salvation and my glory. The rock of my strength and my refuge is in God." You know, to the outside world, David appeared to be in a very weak condition. He was outnumbered. He was outgunned. It even seemed as though he was outsmarted because Ahithophel was sitting there giving counsel unto Absalom. And Ahithophel's counsel, it was viewed as the oracles of God. He was a very witty and wise individual. And boy, he hated David. And he knew what it would take to pursue after that king. So if you're an outside observer, you would say this: David has no hope and no chance. He's in a weak condition. And David said, you know what? To the world right now, I'm weak. He said, but I know this. I'm actually strong. He said, in God is my salvation and my glory, the rock of my strength, and my refuge is in God. And David, as he took shelter in his Lord, he encouraged himself in all that he knew God had revealed Himself to be. And so he came to the conclusion, why in the world should I fear man when I'm trusting in God? He said, I've got no doubt that God is a God of deliverance and of defense, and trusted that when everything was said and done, that God would get the glory, that it would belong unto the one that cannot be moved. Folks might ask, well, how does God get glory in situations like today? I'll just be very honest. I don't know. But I do know this. He will get glory unto Himself. You see, God's got a plan and a program that's being worked out before our very eyes. And we're like kids that have seen perhaps sat down on the floor while mom's done a needlework, and all we see are the tagged and ragged ends. It's God who sees the finished picture. It's God who sees the design that He's working out. And so all I know is this: God will get to Him all the glory that is due His name. I may not live to see it in my life, but that's okay. One of these days I will appear before Him, and I will praise Him for everything that I didn't understand right now. And so, David, he made his confession of trust. He received comfort and trust. And then notice how David, he begins to counsel from his trust in verses 8 through 10. David, he begins comforting others with the same comfort he's already received. Notice how he counsels, first of all, by means of exhorting there in verse number 8. He says, trust in Him at all times, ye people. Pour out your heart. Pour out your heart before Him. God is a refuge for us, Selah. And stop and think about that. He said, God's more than a refuge for me. God is a refuge for us. He was looking out to the people of God that no doubt were worried that, we've sided with King David. We've taken our stance on the right, and we may all be going under. And David says, have no fear. It's going to be okay. That he drew off of what he was already experiencing from the comfort that God was comforting him, and he used that to encourage faithful believers to keep looking unto God alone, encouraging God's people to pour out their hearts to the one who does care for them and who will comfort them. Again, in verse number 8, he said, pour out your hearts before Him. God is a refuge for us. That's why we sing. Are you weary? Are you heavy-hearted? Tell it to Jesus. And it's only right that those whom God has helped share the same help and the same hope that they've discovered. One of the best things that we can do for other believers, especially if we see the storms of life blowing upon them, if you can identify with it, you just simply share what God has done for you. If you've walked down that path and you've experienced that same pain they've had, share how God brought you through. Share with them the fears that you faced and how God was faithful and brought you safely to the other side. David counseled by means of exhorting. He also counsels by means of evaluating. In verse number 9, he helps folks to consider the type of men who become his adversaries and the end that they're going to come to. He says, surely men of low degree are vanity, and men of high degree are a lie. To be laid in the balance, they are altogether lighter than vanity. He said, look, some of the folks that are against me, he said they're base. They're men of low degree. He said, but they're altogether vanity. He said they're like a breath that once it's breathed out, it vanishes and it's gone. He said, now others seem to be men of reputation, men of high degree. He said, but their reputation's a lie. He said, they're not what they appear to be. He said, the reality is this, that in the balances of God, they are altogether wanting. In other words, David understood this truth. No matter the outcome in his life at that time, he knew that the day of wicked men will rapidly come to a close. The last couple of years, we have seen wicked men do things I never dreamed I would have seen in my lifetime. I'll be very honest. I really thought the last presidential assassination attempt would have happened before I was born with John Kennedy. And yet we saw, as Trump was a candidate, we saw not one but two attempts upon his life. We're seeing wicked men express unrestraint and wickedness, and I know this, I'm not expecting it to get better. But I also know this, wicked men, they'll have their season, but it's a short season. It all comes to an end. And even after we're gone, and this world has been handed over to that wicked one, And the world experiences an unleashed evil like it's never seen before. Do you realize even that is limited by the hand of God? So David, he evaluated it. Okay, they may have their day, but they're like a breath that's been spent. They're altogether vanity. He then counsels by means of entreating in verse number 10. He says, trust not in oppression, and become not vain in robbery. If riches increase, set not your heart upon them. He tells his folks, look, y'all have a dedicated trust. Don't fall for the vanities that vain men are looking unto. He said, everything they're hoping for is soon to dissipate and disappear off the scene. He said, don't let that which is foolish and fleeting capture your hearts and minds. He said, look above the temporal and see the eternal. Don't set your heart on the here and now, because the here and now is going to finally fail. The New Testament tells us this in the book of Colossians, set your affections on things above, where Christ sitteth at the right hand of God. And so, David, he begins to counsel out of trust. And notice with me very quickly David's conclusions of trust there in verses 11 and 12. God has spoken once, twice have I heard this, that power belongeth unto God. Also unto thee, O Lord, belongeth mercy, for thou renderest to every man according to his work. And David said it's inescapable. He said, I have come to this conclusion right here. Trusting God is always the right course of action. Notice David's conclusion concerning God's power. In verse number 11, he says, God has spoken once, twice have I heard this, that power belongeth unto God. Now that phrase, God has spoken once, twice have I heard this, it would kind of be like in English whenever we say, look, if I've heard it once or if I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. And so David is saying, man, I have heard this, and I have heard this, and I have heard this, and I have heard this. He said, but I've heard it because it's true. He said, God is the one who holds all power. Christian, do you realize this evening that God is the one who has the power of might, the power of authority, the power of rule and righteousness? So really, what is it that man can do? Do you realize that man can only go as far as God allows? And when God says no further, guess what? No further. And so David said, well, God, you're in control. All of this is in your hands, so really, I've got nothing to worry about whatsoever. And then David came to a conclusion concerning God's purview there in verse number 12. He said, also unto thee, O Lord, belongeth mercy, for thou renderest to every man according to his work. He realized mercy and judgment belong unto God. And he knew this. Our God is a God who delights in mercy. God delivers mercy. And those who will trust Him receive His mercy. No doubt David daily rejoiced in the mercy of God. He's rejoicing in the mercy of God, though he's on the run for his life. David, by faith, believed what would be recorded later in the book of Lamentations, but he believed God's mercies are new every morning. He believed God had mercy that was specific for his situation. That God has mercy and it's abundant and free to anyone who will trust Him and receive of His mercy. But he also knew this, that God is a righteous judge. And those who refuse His mercy, the Bible says, for thou renderest to every man according to his works. That if man will not receive of God's mercy, they will be rewarded according to their works. And by the way, not every reward in Scripture is a good reward. And this is definitely not a reward that man wants, to be rewarded according to our works. And David said, I'm going to receive the mercies of God. They're going to receive the reward of their works. He says, I'll just trust Him. Rebellion swirled around him. And yet David, he steadied his heart by trusting in God. He understood, God, you're not shaken because of my situation. And so, as a believer, the best thing that David could do was simply trust God through the midst of his trial. So, Christian, let me ask you something. Like David, when your world is turned upside down, will you only trust Him? Set your confidence on Him. Because I promise you, He'll be as faithful to you as He was to David. Stand this evening and we'll be dismissed in a word of prayer.